1 Kings chapter 17, then the word of the Lord came to Elijah. Leave here, turn eastward, hide in the Kerith ravine. East of the Jordan, you will drink from the brook, and I have directed the ravens to supply you with food there. So he did what the Lord had told him. He went to the Kerith ravine. I think a lot of times it says the brook Cherith. That's how I've kind of always read it. I'm reading from the NIV, but I think the New King James says the brook Cherith. East of the Jordan, and stayed there. The ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning. Everybody say ravens. Brought him bread and meat in the morning and meat in the evening. So this is where I've got my message title from, called Breakfast of Champions. So right here, every single morning, the ravens come and give him some bread and some meat, right? They just drop off a sausage, egg, and cheese McMuffin every single morning for the prophet. And he drank from the brook. You can be seated. The background of this story, I believe many of you will be somewhat familiar with it, so I'm not naive to that. But I feel like there's something I've seen here that's a little unique that I personally have never seen or heard. And so if you'll hang on with me through a familiar story, I believe it'll speak to you. There's a drought going on in Israel. This is a severe drought that's going to last a little over 3 years. And God comes to the prophet Elijah. He says, what I want you to do is I want you to go to the brook Cherith. Cherith means to cut off from, to cut loose from, to cut away from. And so he's literally being cut off from everything and everyone he knows. And he's going to spend about a year at this brook. And God says to him, what I'm gonna do is, as you're at this place where you're cut off from everything and everyone you've known, is I'm going to send ravens, and these ravens are going to show up to feed you. Now, if you're Elijah, you would have expected God to lead you to the brook, right? Because Psalms 23, right? He leads us beside the still waters. If you're Elijah, you would have known that you can be in the middle of the desert and God can make water come out of a rock. He would have known that God would use the brook. However, where the story begins to be a little unique is that God said he's going to use the raven. And this would have begun to be a challenge. This would be a challenge for Elijah. And I just want to take a second and just say God is very clear. Over 300 times in scriptures, a bird would swoop down and God would use that to teach a spiritual lesson. Jesus, for example, talked about where the eagles gathered, referring to communion or the partaking of his broken body and shed blood. Jesus referred to the sparrow, just teaching us our value and how God cares for us. And he said that God attends the funeral of every sparrow, just helping us understand how attentive God is to every detail of his creation. And so he uses birds. Jesus said that we're to look to the birds into the sky, that God will speak to us. Again, it's not the bird as much as it's the one who created the bird that we should be looking to speak to us. And so God says to Elijah, I'm gonna use this raven to feed you. Now, as a Jewish man, as a prophet to Israel, he would have been kosher. So he would have been familiar with Leviticus 11:15 and Deuteronomy 14 and verse 14. Both of those verses explain to us that the raven is an unclean bird. That if you are Jewish, you're to have no association with the raven. You're to not eat the raven. You're not to eat something that comes from the raven. And that the raven primarily is a bird that has an appetite for dead things. And so for us, this would be the buzzard or the vulture that on the way to church today, if you drove by some roadkill and maybe you saw a deer carcass, or maybe you saw a dead raccoon that was there, and you saw these buzzards, and they've got their claws and they're ripping away the flesh, and they got their beaks buried down into the innards. Come on, this is a good little graphic sermon. Just kind of the innards, and just if you throw up in your mouth a little bit, that means it's a good sermon. Okay, so they're pulling out the liver, right, and the intestines, and the smell and the stench of death is everywhere. And you and I drive by that and we're like, oh God, that's nasty. Surely that bird could go find a cornfield or a wheat field or a barley field, or heck, go rob some fruit from somebody's garden, right? Go rob some vegetables from somebody's garden. Why, of all the things that are out there to eat, is this bird so drawn? His appetite is stirred by the stench of death. That's a species of raven. That vulture and that buzzard are a species of raven. Noah would teach us that these two birds, there's two birds that would teach us about our own natures. For example, when the flood had descended and Noah's trying to figure out if it's safe to get off the ark, the first bird that he sends out is the raven. And the raven goes out, and the raven never returns, never comes back. Noah needed one thing from him, and that's to tell him, hey, is it safe to let the door down and to leave the ark? But the raven never returns, and commentaries would tell us that the reason the raven would never return is not because it found a tree branch, or not because it found a mountaintop somewhere to land on, but it's because there would have been dead bodies floating after that kind of a flood. And so that raven would have gone out there, and it would have smelled the death, and it would have saw all the bodies and all the corpses, and it would have just been in all of its glory. Just out there, just would have jumped from body to body to body and just fed on all the dead things. And then because the raven never returned, Noah sent out the dove. The dove went out into the same environment, but the dove couldn't stand being out there. It smelled death, it saw death, and it quickly grabbed an olive branch and couldn't wait to get back in the ark, couldn't wait to get into the care of Noah once again. And so God used this to teach us about the two natures, the raven nature and the dove nature. The raven being a dark, a drawing to lifeless things and dead things. The dove nature being a drawing to life and to be a drawing to that which is pure and that which is holy. And so if you're Elijah, you would have had access to these same truths, and you would have thought to yourself, nah, I don't think God would use a raven. God would definitely use a dove. I could see God using the gentle, delicate dove to feed me, but God's not gonna use a raven. I could see God maybe even use the mighty, majestic eagle, right? As it's soaring through the sky, God would use an eagle, but there's no way God would use this raven, this filthy, unclean, unattractive, ugly, evil, flesh-eating, carnivorous bird. But God comes to Elijah and he teaches him a powerful lesson that I want us to catch today, and that is God does use the raven in our lives. God does use the unclean. God will use the negative. God will use the ugly, the unattractive to feed you. God will use the painful. God will use the trial, the trouble, the struggle. God will use those things that you and I would look and say, there's no way God in any way would use that to feed me. Yeah, God would use the dove, and yeah, God would use the mighty eagle, but there's no way that God would let the raven be that which feeds me. But what we learn in this story is you only get so far in your relationship with God. Your greatness can only go so far in the things of God if you only let the positive feed you, if you only let the good things in life feed you. I hope that today you're kind of in a dove-like service, right? I hope the Holy Spirit is here speaking to you. I see the church as like the mighty eagle, right? We're that encouraging eagle, letting you know, hey, you know, God can renew your strength, and you can mount up with the wings like the eagles, and no matter what, you know, you can run and not be weary, and you can walk and not faint. I hope that happens. But what Elijah teaches us is you'll only go so far until you learn to let the raven feed you too. What if I told you that horrible divorce, or that abuse that you faced, or the abandonment that you experienced? What if I said, I want you to take that thing that brings the most pain to your life, and I want you to see it as the raven, And now what I want you to see is that thing that caused pain and that thing that devastated you and maybe isolated you and took you off to that Cherith of your own, that place where you were cut off maybe from the things that you wanted in life and that you looked to in life. And maybe there you felt unwanted or unloved, or maybe there you felt like something was wrong with you. But what God is trying to teach us in those places is he's trying to teach us that champions are not just learning to be fed from the positive. They don't just lean to the encouraging. Champions know how to go ahead and feed on the negative too. They know how to feed on the difficult things of life, the devastating things of life, the painful things of life can feed you too. And so there's 3 ways God can use the raven in your life. Number 1, ravens are leavers. So God will use the people that have walked out of your life. God will use the people that leave you. Ravens abandon their babies early, many times before the young can even feed themselves. Job 38 and verse 4 says, God provides food for the raven when its young cries out to God and wonders about the lack of food. The imagery here is that here is this young raven who should have the support, should be provided for by its parents. But they've abandoned the little raven, and there it cries out and wonders, how am I gonna survive? I have no food, and I'm just a child. I have no way to provide for myself. And maybe you're wondering as you look at your life, how am I gonna survive this? I'm raising a child and it's just me and I don't have the spouse. I'm trying to, raise a family and I don't have the support I need. Or maybe you're a child or a young person and you don't have the support in your family environment. Maybe you have the opposite of support. You live in a dangerous environment. Or maybe you're just looking around your life and you don't feel like people understand you. And so you just find yourself isolated in life. But what I want you to see is that God will use that in your life. God's not afraid to use the raven. I think about how many times we have this tendency to see, oh, that's the dove family over there. Look at the dove family, right? Just the perfect, pure, right? Just got everything together. Just the moms, just the delicate, gentle little dove, just the dove mom. You know what I'm talking about? Just, oh, here's your lunch, baby. Here you go. Here you go. Let me just just wipe that off your little face, just the gentle mom. And I hope you have a dove family, I really do. Or some of us look over and we see like the mighty eagle family, right? They just got everything going for them. They're just strong and together and just mighty. Everything they do is might. And oh man, I wish I had that kind of a family. But you're looking at your situation and you kind of feel like, I'm like that little baby raven. I'm crying out when I'm in service. God, how am I gonna survive? I don't have the support. I don't have the love. I don't have those kind of things in my life. I don't have the eagle. I don't have the dove. I'm just the opposite. I feel abandoned in life. But understand, ravens are leavers. It's in their nature. Remember, Noah took in the raven. That raven would have died with every other raven had Noah not took it into the ark. Noah cared for the raven. He nurtured the raven. He fed the raven. And he needed one thing from that raven, to go out for just a brief moment and let him know if it was safe, to bring back something that would say it's good to go ahead and leave. That's all he needed. And then he could go and live his life. Just that one basic thing. That raven owed its life to Noah. But the second the window opened, that raven could care less what Noah's needs are, took off, went about its own business, and it never returned to the ark. Because ravens are leavers. They're uncommitted to what's important in life or what's most important in life. Luke 12:24, Jesus, the Bible says, takes care of the young, abandoned raven. Notice Jesus never abandons anybody. He never leaves you and he'll never forsake you. And I love this even more. He feeds those who have been abandoned. That is the breakfast of a champion. This is how it looks. We look at our life and we think to ourselves, maybe it was a parent that should have been there and wasn't. Maybe it was a family dynamic that hurt you, wounded you. Maybe it was a spouse that left your life, exited your life. Maybe it was a friend who walked away. Maybe it was a pastor that should have been there to encourage you, but in some way wounded you. Maybe it was a teacher, a coach. We could keep on going, but for the sake of time, let's just take a second and say there was someone, they should have been there, they should have been for you, but they left, they walked out, they ghosted you, and you looked at that, and at first you came up with this empty bowl. This bowl of thinking, man, how am I ever gonna survive? I don't know if I'm ever gonna make it. I thought they would be there. I thought they would be a part of my life. I thought that that's a person that would be present, but they left. And what God did for you in that time is he was teaching you how he can make the breakfast of a champion. And what he was teaching you is that he would pour you a big old bowl of his faithfulness, and that you could feed on the faithfulness of God, even in the midst of people being unfaithful. And he was teaching you how to feed on the fact that he would be there when everyone else wasn't. And he was teaching you when they walked out, he walked in. When they left, he entered. When they found the exit door, he found the entrance to your life. When they quit and gave up and said you weren't worth their time anymore, he said, that's when I'm gonna step in, and I'll never give up on you, and I'll never quit on you. And there's just something about learning to feed on the faithfulness of God that can make you a champion in life. Lou Ferrigno, the Incredible Hulk, first Incredible Hulk, I guess I should say, when he was a child, developed an ear infection that caused him to go partially deaf. And not only did he have a hearing disability, but his father was very critical of him because of his disability. Was always coming down on Lou, what he would never be, what he couldn't be, that he would never be a success, that he was a nothing, that he was a nobody. However, Lou would go on to become the youngest bodybuilder to win Mr. Universe at 20 years of age. And he would say, I had to become better than the average person to succeed. What was he saying? He was saying, my whole life I was surrounded by the lack of support. I had not only my physical disability, but emotionally and mentally in my home life, there was a disability as well. And so every day he would go to the gym and he was lifting those weights. Every time he would go into the gym and he would work out, he was eating the breakfast of champions. He was pushing off of him. He said I would be a nobody. He said and he would push that off of him, and he became who he did because of all the things that were working against him. I think you have to come to this place where you learn, if you're gonna be a champion in the things of God, if you're gonna be a champion in business, if you're gonna be a champion in your family, you have to make a decision to say, if you don't believe in me, it's okay, because I believe in me. I hope that you do. I wish that you would. It would mean a lot to me if I had you kind of be the dove in my life or be the mighty eagle in my life. But if you want to be a raven, that's fine too, because I've learned if no one else will believe, I have to believe that God can do something great in my life. Number 2, ravens are after the eye. It says that ravens seem to be most drawn initially to the eye of the dead thing that they're feeding off of. So the first raven to get there gets the eye. It's like a delicacy for a raven, the eye. Our eyes speak of our awareness, self-awareness, others' awareness. Speaks of our perspective, how I see everything in life, how I see myself, people, church, how I see God, how I see my enemies, my trials, my struggles. All of that has to do in Scripture with my eyes. Not necessarily the natural eye, but learning that God has given me the ability to perceive things. God's given me the ability to be aware of things. And I need that kind of a sensitivity in life. I need to have perspective on situations. I need to be able to look past things and not just see them at face value, but read things, read behind things. I need to have the wisdom to even see, is the devil at work here? Is this a spiritual thing? Is God removing this from my life? I have to have perception to do that. But the spirit of a raven will target your eyes. So So you walk around blind to your potential, blind to the will of God. This is why Jesus said in Luke 4 and verse 18, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he's anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He sent me to release the captives and to make sure there's a recovery of sight to the blind and to set free all of those who are oppressed. God understands how important it is that we have eyes, that we can see, that we can perceive, that we can understand. In Judges chapter 7, God goes to Gideon and he says, hey, you're a mighty man. You're not just a mighty man, you're a valiant man. And Gideon hears it and he's like, yeah, I mean, you don't understand. I'm in a nation that's highly oppressed, barely surviving. In that nation, there's a tribe. I'm in the tribe that's the least of all the tribes. Within that tribe, I'm in a family that's the least of all the families in the tribe. And then in my family, I'm the least of everybody in my family. So what Gideon is telling the angel is, hey, I don't know who you see, but I can tell you who I see. Who I see is I'm the least of the least of the least. I'm the last person to succeed. Ain't no way anything great can come out of my life. I've been told my whole life I was a nothing, I was a nobody. That's all I've ever heard. But the angel of the Lord says, no, you're mighty and you're valiant and God's got great things for you. What was God trying to do? He's trying to heal his eyes, trying to heal the way he saw, the way he perceived. And so God raises Gideon up to have the courage to try to go defeat these Midianites who had caused Israel to be living in caves and clefts of rocks and off in the forest and off in the woods. And every now and then a family would put together a little garden to feed their family, and the Midianites would hear about it and come and plunder and destroy any good thing happening for the people of Israel. And so God says to Gideon, I want you to pull together an army and I want you to fight the Midianites. So he pulls together this army. It ends up being about 300 people in the end, and it's 300 against 135,000. So again, he's looking at the greatness of his enemy. He's looking at what's going on, and he's looking at what he's got. He's looking at, and he's outnumbered, and there's no way he can accomplish what's going on. And so God says, I want you to go down and listen to what your enemy is saying, and you'll be encouraged. And so he goes down and he listens to what the enemy is saying, and the enemy sees him as more powerful than he sees himself. And he starts to hear how the enemy sees him and how the enemy fears him. And as he hears it, Gideon starts to be encouraged, and he starts to say, my God, if the enemy can see that something great's going on in us, if the enemy can see us as powerful, maybe we should start believing in ourselves. So I love this part. So Gideon says, okay, we're gonna do it. 300 against 135,000. We're going, we're gonna do it. He says, but if we win, if we defeat them, my instructions are bring me the head of the king. There's actually 2 kings over the Midianites. He said, I want you to bring me their heads. The first king is King Oreb. And you know what Oreb means, what the name Oreb means? Raven. And he said, then I want you to bring me the king of Zeb, the king Zeb's head, which means wolf. I want you to bring me the head of that king raven and the head of that king wolf. I want you to bring me their head. So the 300 go against 135,000. They defeat them. They're on the run. And they catch up to them, and they cut the head of King Raven off, and they cut the head of King Wolf off. And Gideon's already at the breakfast table. And they come and they set that king, the head of that King Raven on that table. And they set the head of that King Wolf on that table. And if we could eat some breakfast with Gideon, if we could talk to him just a little bit as he's looking in the eyes of that raven, and he's looking in the eyes of that wolf that tried to take his life. Did you know in Yellowstone National Park, that they say that the gangs of ravens and the packs of wolves work together? The raven goes out ahead of time and it starts to look for the prey, and when he notices it's in a weakened conditions, the raven communicates back to the wolf. As it is in the natural, so it is in the spirit. Just something about the spirit of a raven. He's out, he's watching, just so he can send the spirit of a wolf. He's just sending that, and that's what we are, by the way. That's what Jesus taught us, is that we're sheep in a wolf world. And you say, I don't wanna be a sheep. I don't wanna be a sheep, that sounds weak. I wanna be a wolf, that sounds strong. You don't understand, you don't get it. There's a difference between being a sheep with Jesus as your shepherd. And can I just say, there is nothing more powerful. Remember, they called Jesus a lamb and he took away the sins of the world. Ain't nothing more powerful than a sheep if he's your shepherd. It's not saying you're dumb, it's not saying you're naive, it's not saying you're weak, it's saying you're up under his care and you're in his flock, and that's a powerful thing. But as a sheep, sometimes we get off over here, and that raven watches. Calls that wolf over. And Gideon, his whole life, been dealing with the struggle, how he sees himself. Couldn't believe in himself. But now he's looking in the eyes of that king raven. He's looking in the eyes of that king wolf. If we had the time, and we don't, I wish I could introduce you to all the raven's heads I have on my spiritual mantle. All the people over the years, 30 years now I've been serving God. 1997, so I don't know how, 24 years now in full-time ministry. This is all I've done my whole life. And along the way, I've met so many ravens. Come on. But the truth is, today, they just made me breakfast. Finally, ravens have a distinct cry. The raven's cry denotes the cry of death. When they circle their prey, their cry is as if they're longing for the demise and the death of their prey. They also said that ravens are incredibly intelligent birds. They're great communicators. That like a parrot can learn words, a raven much more so can learn sentences if they're taught. So the raven's cry is a very intentional, intelligent cry to basically say, you're not gonna make it. You're not gonna survive. We got you. You're never gonna make it. Some of us need to be encouraged, and we need someone to affirm us and believe in us and speak good things to us, but that's not the breakfast of champions. Talk to any champion in any arena of life, and they would say, yeah, I had people believe in me along the way. But that's not where you truly learn to be a champion. The greatest athletes in the world, they appreciate the good press, but you wanna know what really drives them? It's the bad press. Before Elijah went to the brook Cherith, he was called Elijah the Tishbite, which means stranger of strangers. In other words, Elijah was a nobody in the midst of nobodies. But when he came out of that time with the brook, out of that time of being fed by the ravens, he was called Elijah, the man of God, who people said when he spoke, it was as if God was speaking. What took him from being normal to a champion was the breakfast and dinner every single day that the raven's cry brought him. Every time someone says you can't, every time someone says you'll never, every time someone says that's impossible, every time someone tries to intimidate you in some way because they don't feel like you've got the raw materials that you need to be great in life, and so they speak down to you, you just have to learn to say, thank you, I appreciate that. I was hungry anyway, and I'll just go ahead and allow that to feed me. I'll never forget before I started pastoring here almost 17 years ago now. And I was young, insecure, not really sure of my abilities, still probably somewhat that way, but nonetheless, it makes me feel better to say it was a long time ago. And there was somebody I somewhat looked up to who was a pastor, and he said, you know, Marcus will destroy that church. It's the exact phrase, Marcus will destroy that church. And I just thought, man, who would ever say something like that? I mean, just such a difficult thing to say. And this is the truth. That pastor was around 60 years old, and you know what? That church doesn't exist today. That pastor did destroy his church. I don't say that to gloat. I don't say that to gloat. But for the grace of God, come on, we all be stupid in a second, right? Can we be real in church for just a second? I know your relatives are here, but none of us are above that. None of us are, including me. I say that humbly and with a broken heart. But what I learned through that and through the long line of other ravens' cries is that when I get weary and I get tired and I think, man, I'm just not really sure I can keep doing this. I'm not really sure I'm cut out for it. And you know, in my world, it's kind of like, the NFL means not for long. Well, you know how many pastors retire? How many people start out in ministry and retire in ministry? You want to know how many? 8%. 8% of people that start this finish this. So every week I hear of another pastor didn't make it, burned out, couldn't do it, couldn't handle it. And I hear that phrase, he'll destroy that church. And it's not the people that believed in me that motivate me. It's not the people that loved me along the way. I thank God for them, and I'm not saying that it doesn't help me, but I hear those words. And today it feeds me. Today it drives me. Today it motivates me, because it was something about that raven's cry in my ear that I say to myself, I cannot give up. I cannot quit. I cannot let up. I cannot let what they said have the final say. I can't do it. I can't do it. There's got to be another voice I listen to. There's got to be another cry I listen to, and I'm not going to let the cry of the raven have the final say. Instead, I feed on it, and I allow it to drive me. Did you know that every critic you've had, every evil, deadly, cursed word someone ever spoke over your life, they're circling, and that cry was longing for your demise. If you let what they say be the truth about you, you'll always be a victim. But Numbers 14:28, God said, as you have spoken in my ears, I will do it for you. As you spoke into my ears, this is what God says, I'll do that for you. God does not listen to what someone else says in his ears or anyone else's ears about you. God does not do for you what someone else said about you. God will do for you whatever you say in the ear of God, whatever you say about you, that God said, I'll do it for you. I'm nothing, I'm nobody, okay. He's listening. I can't ever serve God. I'll never break free from this addiction. I'll never heal from that hurt. I'll never love again. I'll never laugh again. Okay, be careful. He's listening. He's listening. You're nothing, you're worthless, we could go on and on, the horrible things people speak into our ears. God's not listening to what they say about you. He's listening to what you say about you. There's a young woman by the name of Wilma who was born prematurely at 4.5 pounds. Doctors didn't believe she would survive. This was in the 1950s, actually the 1940s, and because of segregation issues, her mom and her were not able to get the care she needed from the local hospital, and so the mom took her home, and just by a miracle of God, she was able to nurse her daughter Wilma. Mrs. Rudolph was able to nurse her daughter Wilma to health. But because of being born so prematurely, she struggled with immunity issues her whole life. And so the mom was constantly dealing with one thing after another: measles, chicken pox, smallpox, mumps, scarlet fever. She had a double pneumonia. And so because of all the things that the mom was having to deal with, she unfortunately didn't notice that there was something wrong with Wilma's feet, that they were weak and deformed. And by the time she caught it and went to the doctor, they told her that she's had polio, and it's a crippling disease in which there is no cure. And the doctor looked at Mrs. Rudolph and she said, "Your daughter will never walk. She'll never walk." Mrs. Rudolph took her daughter home, and again, just because of the lack of medical help in her area, she learns that in Nashville, which is about 50 miles away, that there is a hospital at a university there that will help her daughter potentially walk again. And so twice a week for 2 years, she takes her daughter, Wilma, to this hospital. 50 miles there, 50 miles back, twice a week for 2 years. They eventually fit her with some braces and some corrective shoes and some crutches, and she's able to begin to walk again. Though the expectation wasn't great to ever be free from these things, after a period of years, she starts to shed the crutches, and then eventually she sheds the braces, and then eventually she doesn't need the corrective shoes anymore, and she starts to discover that she's somewhat of an athlete. And so she decides that she's gonna play sports. She ends up becoming a basketball star, initially setting state records in her state, and then ends up taking her team, leading her team to the state championship. Then she ends up becoming a track star, and at the age of 16, in 1956, she goes to the Olympics and wins a bronze medal. 4 years later, she goes to the Olympics. In 1960, she goes to the Olympics in Rome, and she becomes the first woman to ever win the first American woman to ever win 3 gold medals. And she is considered one of the greatest athletes of all time because of her accomplishment. But what I want you to hear is this: her whole life, from the time she was born, they told her, "You'll never do this, you'll never do that." Her whole life, she was pushed aside, she was pushed down, she was told she would be a nobody. But again, there's just something about a champion that all of that just becomes food for you. All of that just becomes, I didn't say it, God said it. I'll send the raven to feed you. I'll send something that maybe you didn't want, but I'll send it, and it'll feed you, and it'll strengthen you, and you'll come out of this season greater, stronger than you could have ever imagined, not because of the dove and not because of the eagle, but because God uses the raven too. Remember, Jesus is going to the cross, and the crowd is crying out, "Crucify him." They're choosing Barabbas, a murderer, over Jesus. He's innocent, but they're crying out, "Crucify him." The word cry there in the Greek literally means the raven's cry. What Jesus is hearing as he goes to the cross is he's hearing the cry of that raven, crying out for his death, crying out for his demise. Jesus, of course, goes and he's beaten, carries that horrible cross for your sin and my sin. Take him up to Calvary, they nail him to that cross. And those cries, those mockings, they spit on him, they ripped his beard out of his face, they beat him. Again, you're nothing, you're a nobody, you're a joke. And that raven's cry was all he heard. But it's interesting to me that Jesus allowed that to motivate him to go to the cross. He allowed that to drive him to go to the cross. And as he hung there, he wasn't looking for revenge. He wasn't looking to get the raven back. He was actually expressing forgiveness to the raven. Why? Because while they were trying to kill him, Jesus was feeding. He was eating. All of that was food for him to go to the cross. Why? Because he knew in the end the raven's cry don't have the final say. Eventually, that raven's cry stops. And God has a chance to speak. And Jesus knew at some point, God's gonna speak up. And the Bible says 3 days later, of course, Jesus got up out of that grave because God always has the final say. The ravens don't have the final say.